So this morning, friends, we looked back. We looked backwards into our murky past, obscured by the vastness of time, and we did our best to uncover the road that led us here today. So now we turn our gaze to the equally uncertain future, asking questions of morality and justice about realities not yet realized. And while we don't know exactly how the future will unfold, it is important that we are prepared, having thought deeply and carefully about the future that we wish to create for ourselves and our descendants. So often our technology outpaces our morality, and we're left playing catch-up after the fact, after we've crossed some boundary we didn't know existed prior. So with that in mind, I would like to invite our panelists to come forward to take a seat as we begin to think about what it means to be a human in the era of gene editing, of technological enhancements, of artificial intelligence. Now it's my honor to introduce our esteemed panel. Dr. Maria Ficarra is the professor and chair of biology and the pre-med advisor here at Eastern University. Dr. Jeffrey Lawton is professor of biochemistry here at Eastern University. And the Reverend Dr. Charmaine Green is an adjunct professor at Eastern's School of Christian Ministry. She's also the community program coordinator for the Center to Eliminate Cancer Disparities of the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center at Thomas Jefferson University. Thank you for being with us today and for bringing your unique perspectives and experiences here with us. So as I said, this morning, we discussed the long and arduous evolutionary process that brought us to what modern Homo sapiens are. And in recent years, technologies, very disruptive technologies, like CRISPR, have given us the power to quickly change our own genome without having to rely on those tried and true, long processes of natural selection. And some of the Christian community are afraid that with this and other similar disruptive medical technologies that we are verging on playing God, that by changing our sacred DNA or enhancing in some way, shape, or form what it means to be a human, that we are spitting in the face of our Creator, or at least getting ourselves in over our heads. Others would say that we are merely continuing in a long tradition of healing given to us by the great physician. And I'm sure there are 1,000 positions in the middle, because we are not a people who hold to dichotomies here today. Do you have ethical concerns with the direction of modern medicine, keeping all those things in mind? And if so, what do you think scientists and lay people should be considering these days? And we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. And I give thanks to God that I teach at a university where we can talk about faith and science in the open. I believe that God gave us science as a gift to use for good, to use as medicine, to aid in helping others, to heal their infirmities. The issue for many when looking at the potential for these gene editing technologies like CRISPR is how far to go. I always tell my students, just because we have the technology to do something, does that mean that we should do it? The inventors themselves, like Dr. Jennifer Doudna, realized that there needs to be awareness of the power of this technology, but that we need to set standards and not move too quickly without asking important questions. CRISPR, or clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, allows scientists a very specific way to edit the DNA of an individual. And Jennifer Doudna stated, quote, CRISPR is a tool that scientists and clinicians around the world are using to understand our genetics, the genetics of every living thing, and most importantly, to intervene in genetic disease. I believe using CRISPR technology to treat genetic diseases like sickle cell disease in adult patients, which was the first case of its use in humans, is considered to be medicine. This use of CRISPR, or gene editing, is affecting the somatic or body cells and not the sex cells, the eggs and sperm. Therefore, changes will not be passed on to future generations. Granted, it is altering the DNA of individuals, but given that the patient is an adult and capable of consent, I believe the decision is not compromising their humanity or going against God's plan. They may want to be healed. I think of John chapter 5, verses 1 to 9, when Jesus encountered sick people by the pool, and he met a man that had an illness for 38 years, and Jesus asked him, "Do you want to be well again?" He said he had no one to put him in the pool, but Jesus told him, "Get up," and he was cured at once. So there are people that want to be healed and put in the pool, and CRISPR can be a way to help them. True, it's not entirely easy. The patient needs to assume risks with this procedure, such as shutting down their immune system to do a bone marrow transplant, for example, in order to be healed. But they evaluate that risk is worth it given the medical issues that they may face. But when talking about editing or altering embryos, that is another matter for me. As a Roman Catholic, I do not support any experimentation on embryos or embryonic stem cells of any kind. Life is sacred, and these are truly the least of these, the voiceless, and they need our protection. Even with the good intention of wanting to cure disease, manipulating embryos will affect the future generations, since germline gene editing, which is passed on, versus the somatic gene editing, which dies with the person. And these embryos did not give consent. Let's take a case of an embryo that has been determined to carry the gene that causes deafness, for instance. It's not fatal, but parents do not want their child to be deaf. Correcting that gene will change the direction of that child's life. Many deaf people don't even consider it to be a disability. I had a student who is deaf and got cochlear implants and dedicated her whole life to wanting to become an audiologist to help children like she was, and she is an audiologist today. Seems like editing embryos is like rewriting the script of the story of our lives or their lives. And it's an issue of control, and we love control. Human beings are made in the image of God, but God is the creator. Are we editing what God made? Are we saying he made a mistake? Do we have the right to correct his code? It will be changing evolution. It will shrink the human gene pool. But what else can happen? Even in the case of gene editing in adults to cure disease, which I can support, can widen socioeconomic conditions and disparities in the community, like if only the rich can get cured. Will gene editing diminish the dignity of people with illnesses or marginalized groups who can't afford to get this treatment? Will the dominant groups set the standard for what it means to be human? Editing out characteristics deliberately goes against our drive in the society for inclusion. Is gene editing even needed? Some people with disabilities say they would not change their disease, that their disease has helped them become the person they are today and brought out their strengths and more. Of course, we want to spare sufferings, but at what the cost is the question. We need to help, but we also need to let God be God and not try to take away his job. Just some thoughts.
Thank you.
Well,
good afternoon. I'm also delighted to have the opportunity to spend this time here with all of you and to learn from one another as we share our thoughts and our expertise. I've had the joy of teaching at Eastern University now for 17 years. I'm in my 18th year now teaching undergraduate biochemistry in the chemistry department here on campus. And many of my students are pre-med or pre-physician assistant, and some are heading in other directions within the healthcare field. But I would say the vast majority of my students see their calling in life to be involved somehow in the biomedical enterprise, either in basic research or in directly involved in patient-facing healthcare. And I tell my students that this is a really exciting time to be entering the field of medicine, because we're at a place where new frontiers and revolutionary new technologies are becoming available that are going to completely transform in a short period of time the way medicine is practiced. And it's also exciting time to be a patient, because we know that there's really never been a time like this when discoveries that are made in the laboratory find their way into the clinic at almost light speed. And sooner or later, all of us in this room are going to be benefiting in some way, if we have not already, from discoveries that are being made now in the laboratory. And we also live at a time where any of us here in this symposium could, with reasonably little effort, actually obtain our entire genome sequence for not a whole lot of money. One such company that provides this service, and I'm not endorsing the company, but it's Nebula Genomics. I checked this morning on their website, and they offer direct-to-consumer whole genome sequencing, not just exome, the whole genome, for $299. And so I tell my students that for less than the cost of a college textbook, you could actually have your entire genome sequenced, and you could have the results made available to you from the cloud in a matter of weeks. And now for those of us who are old enough to remember when the Human Genome Project first started in the late 1980s, early 1990s, to sequence the initial draft of the human genome took something like 13 years. And I don't even know how many tens or hundreds of millions of dollars it took. Now we're talking $299, and you can have a link emailed to you where you can download your genome in a matter of weeks. And this really presents us with some very interesting opportunities, because literally in a matter of weeks, I could learn about my entire genetic code, and though I'd be well outside of my lane to interpret it, someone could interpret it and then tell me the genetic basis for some of the things that perhaps I'm good at, and could also tell me the genetic basis for some of the things that I could potentially die from someday. So the question becomes, what do we do with this information? Now, until recently, the information that we would get from our genome was just a big FYI. Wasn't anything we could do about it. But now, with the advent of technologies like CRISPR, very rapidly we're moving from the domain of science fiction very much into reality. The possibility now that if we find something in our genome that we don't like, we have a G, we wish we had an A, that person has a T, I want a T like they have, we actually could do something about it. And we've really just taken the first initial steps to that new era. We now can do something about things we find in our genome that maybe we don't like, or things that we find in our children's genome that we wish weren't there. And so this is also a brand new frontier in medicine, with tremendous implications for the way we address some of the most stubborn and difficult to manage diseases, which would be inborn errors of metabolism, other sorts of genetic diseases, for which the best we've ever been able to do really is to manage the symptoms. And in many cases, even managing the symptoms is very challenging. But now we're standing on the cusp of an era in which we can actually address the cause by correcting the genetic change or the genetic variant that is responsible for that particular disease. In other words, we have the ability now to fix a gene that's broken. But this also, the same technology, of course, can also be used to take an inconvenient gene and make it a little better, or to take a gene that's perfectly fine the way it is and just make it conform to a standard that we wish it could attain. that's where I think the real challenge lies. Finding that dividing line between what's a medical treatment that could address something that at the root cause has a genetic explanation versus taking a gene that's inconvenient or a gene that's perfectly fine and trying to engineer something else out of it. This, I think, is an area where humanity needs to tread very carefully. There was an article written, a very prophetic article, I think, written about 20 years ago now by Michael Sandel, the philosopher at Harvard University. 2004, he published an article in The Atlantic called "The Case Against Perfection: What's Wrong with Designer Children, Bionic Athletes, and Genetic Engineering." 20 years ago, he was predicting the very world that we are standing on the edge of. And among the many points that Dr. Sandel makes in this, one that really resonates with me is a quotation that he took from theologian William F. May. May talks about two sides of love. One side is accepting love. In other words, we accept someone else just as that person is, without expecting that person to change or be different or anything. We accept that person just as he or she is. And then the other side of love is transforming love, where we work with that person, we try to bring out something better, something different in that person through a transforming process. And I think immediately we can recognize that parental love should really carefully balance both of those things. As parents, we should completely and totally accept our children just as they come to us. But at the same time, as parents, we also have a responsibility to our children to transform them through loving actions into being good stewards of the talents that they have, the innate abilities that they have. So that means sometimes arguments about piano lessons, about doing homework, and about taking education seriously, and about applying oneself and building those gifts. The problem is, if the idea of genome engineering moves from strictly medical application to one in which we're trying to engineer perfection, engineer improvements in the human race, especially when we're thinking about children, our own children, that really seems to blur the lines between accepting love and transforming love. It's almost as if we're setting accepting love off to the side, saying, I can't accept you the way you came genetically to me, and so I'm going to do everything that I possibly can to transform you genetically and other ways into what I think you ought to be. William F. May says, accepting love without transforming love slides into indulgence and finally neglect. And we can certainly see that in parenting. Transforming love, and I'm continuing to quote, without accepting love, badgers and finally rejects. And so I think the problem really lies when we take that step from a medical application of this amazing technology and try to see it become something else. We're now talking about engineering improvements and even what we might naively consider to be perfection into our children or into ourselves, missing out on that whole aspect of the giftedness of life.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the non-scientist member on this panel, and as a pastor and a healthcare advocate, I embrace genomic studies because I've seen on the outside how they are used to improve the well-being of individuals that are suffering from particular diseases. I believe that individuals are given gifts. We all have gifts that we're given from God, and scientists are given the gift to understand complex systems, understand computations that a lot of us would not be able to do. And when they use these gifts to help improve the livelihood of humanity, then I see it as them walking with God and sharing their gifts with humanity. On the other hand, as the gentleman was just explaining, when that gift is used to to build an individual to what you want it to be, as opposed to allowing that individual to come to you as God has created it. That is where a problem occurs where it comes to me. I have seen where scientists use genomic studies, genomic sequences to identify particular markers in a tumor, in a cancer tumor. And they use that marker because of that genomic study to provide the specific chemotherapy agent that will kill that cancer, as opposed to having that individual take 2, 3, and 4 agents till they get the right one. So in that end, genomic studies are very helpful because it's targeting a particular purpose and it's improving the well-being of that individual. That is walking in their gift from God. That is using their gift in conjunction with God, with what God has given them to improve the well-being of humanity. But when you start using that gift to alter embryos, to make the child the way you want to do it, to build a child, you are negating the way God created that individual to be. And that becomes a problem with science. That's when you are trying to become God. As opposed to walking with God, they are trying to become God. And that's where the problems occur in science and the use of genomic studies, the use of genetic sequencing. But on the other hand, if the scientists stay aligned with whatever parameters are established with their research agencies, the regulatory agencies, if they stay within those parameters, then they won't go over and create ethical concerns. So they have to stay within whatever the parameters are of their research study. And then we could be assured that whatever research findings we find, they did not in some way go beyond what their scope of that particular study was to create something that they wanted, as opposed to letting the science bring them what was there. And I hope I haven't confused you.
Thank you. Thank you. The microphone has batteries now, so anyone can line up there if you have any questions. You can ask questions in the chat and in the Q&A function on Zoom as well. Does anybody like to be the brave first person? I'm wondering if you can maybe, while they think, pick up on a thread that we heard at the end of the first session, where it seems like we have talked a lot about being made in the image of God. As we wonder what it means to be a human, we keep asking questions of what makes us special, what makes us unique. You mentioned the Human Genome Project, where we can understand people at a molecular level that we couldn't before. Actually, if you pay for a 23andMe study, you can find out if you are attractive to mosquitoes. Turns out my wife is, I'm not. There's a genetic marker for how delicious you are. And all of that kind of starts to play into what this phrase, what this theological idea means. And we've heard a couple of people talk about it in response to, what set us apart from other hominins, what set us apart from the animal kingdom. I'm wondering in your fields, the ways that you think through these things, both biologically, biochemically, and theologically, ministerially. Can you unpack a little bit what it means to be created in the image of God? And specifically, are we ever in danger of undoing that image by changing things too much? Like, you remember that painting that was famous for a while, that person tried to refurbish that painting Jesus, and they made it look like a child did it. Well, remember this? This made its rounds on news for a while. So anyone who'd like to take a stab.
I guess I can begin. That's a great question. Thank you for that one. And it's one that from time to time I think comes up in the minds of students too. We engage students on this campus with some of these sorts of ideas. Interestingly, the concept of being made in the image of God is presented clearly in the opening pages of Scripture, but never explained. And so theologians, of course, have wondered for centuries, what does that actually mean? It's not unpacked anywhere. It's just stated and assumed that we get the message that every human being is made in God's image. And it doesn't seem that any particular people are more in the image of God than anyone else. It also doesn't seem like you can ever really lose the image of God, although that the image of God certainly can be defaced by our brokenness, by our sinfulness. In the New Testament, of course, the phraseology that's used most commonly is being conformed to the image of Christ, which describes God's project of bringing out greater and greater holiness within us by transforming us through the work of the Holy Spirit. But in the Old Testament, it just seems that the image of God is indelibly stamped on every human being. And so, when I think about these sorts of technologies, I don't necessarily see them as endangering the image of God in any being. But one of the ways that the image of God, I think, can be understood is that if we somehow are made in God's image, then there are things about us that should represent God in some way to the world around us. And one of those ways, I think, that we are given the privilege of representing God is the way in which we interact with other people. We're very relational, interactional beings. And so the way we interact with others, I think, has the potential to say a lot about the way that God interacts with us. And certainly, folks who study early childhood development, especially spiritual formation in children, have recognized that young children come to understand at least some concept of God by the way in which that child's parents interact with that person and display love and things like that. And so coming back to an idea that I had sort of begun to share a little bit, this idea of accepting love versus transforming love. I think God gets both of those exactly right. And so when we see Jesus interacting with people time and time again in the Gospels, Jesus is demonstrating acceptance, but he's also interacting with people and transforming them. Right? He accepted Zacchaeus just as he was, this greedy tax collector, said, "I'm staying at your house tonight." Didn't ask whether he could. He just said, "Zacchaeus, I'm staying at your house tonight." And Zacchaeus came down from the tree and then experienced transforming as he then said, "I repent of all my misdeeds. I'm going to return what I've stolen." And there was a transformation that occurred as he was experiencing the love and the acceptance that Jesus showed him. And so if we think about particularly, again, what I kind of outlined from my perspective as being a dangerous area, this idea that this technology could one day become something where it's almost expected that we would design traits into our children or maybe remove traits from our children genetically. That seems to really transgress against this idea of accepting love. And what would that say to a child, for that child to gradually come to realize that, okay, I had to be edited before my parents were willing to have me in the family or have me in this world. I wasn't okay the way I was. My parents needed to use technology to change some things. That child, how would that affect or influence that child's developing understanding of God's accepting? If they only experience maybe what might be considered an extreme example of transforming, we're going to edit your DNA first, something like that. It seems to me like if we're going to really live in God's image, then the way we interact with others, especially those closest to us, our children often, needs to reflect that as well. And accepting love needs to be balanced with transforming love.
I could reflect as a biologist on the question of being made in God's image. So Biology is the study of life, so our students are interested in various things, like many students are interested in animals or plants, the creation, the environment, and that's all good, and God created all of that. But we know that humanity is set apart from the rest of God's creation, right? Plants are not made in the image of God. We are. And as Jeff was mentioning, all these wonderful things about love and God's love and our ability to love just, sets us apart from the rest of creation. I know you're not supposed to have special, like favorite children in the family, but I feel like we're probably the favorite of God's, right? Because we are humans and made in his image and have the ability to worship him and love him and work and share him with others. Relational, like you're talking about, and just seeing God in each other. It just sets us apart from all the rest of creation. And so how important that is in terms of keeping that sacred image of God and not altering it in a way that doesn't bring him pleasure. So just some thoughts.
I would have to agree with that, especially the last statement you made. Yes, God has created us in his image, and if we are accepting God as our Father and our Creator, when we change that image in whatever way, does that change does it change how God looks at us? Does it mean that we're not pleased with how God created us, so we are making changes so that we can be this way? So does that in turn have God look at us differently?
Thank you. All right, there was somebody moving towards the microphone earlier. There's 3 people moving towards the microphone. Excellent. And talk as closely to the microphone as you can.
Good afternoon. I heard all 3 of you touch on the topic of building people to what you want them to be. Well, I have a comment and a question. When it comes to building people who you want them to be, the Bible teaches us in Ephesians 36:27 that only God can take a heart of stone and turn it into a heart of flesh. So my question is, with God being the only one that can change people, whether it be spiritually, naturally, when is the line crossed? What is the difference between CRISPR and IVF? What is the difference between healing someone's cancer and picking out what gender you want for your child? Oh, and also, with CRISPR, can it also take care of issues in mental health and cognitive intellectual disabilities after someone is born?
Well, I was having a conversation over lunch with the ladies that were at my table, and we were talking about in vitro. CRISPR, we were talking about it because a friend that she knows was unable to carry her child. So her eggs were used, her husband's sperm was used to fertilize his egg, but then another individual carried that child for her. So this child was born and is thriving well. To me, that was a gift of God, that particular process was developed because of people who had the know-how to fertilize the embryo outside of the body, but house that embryo so that it can go back into a body to be born. That is not, to me, that is not genetic altering. That is just creating outside of the normal what has been known to be normal to create a human being. CRISPR takes your genes and alters them. So there are 2 different issues that you put together, that you posed. The in vitro is something different than what is going on with CRISPR. So CRISPR is using the technology to change the genetic makeup. In vitro isn't changing, it's just providing another way for an individual to be born. But CRISPR is changing the DNA for whatever reason to alter that egg, that embryo, for whatever they want it to be. Now, I don't know enough about it to know whether or not it can pick sequences to see if this particular embryo has genetic defaults in this area or that area, or whatever area. But I'm sure that it does, because I think my panelist friend here said that someone that she knows has ocular hearing problems, had hearing problems, and there's something that with the genetic changes in CRISPR, you can identify that. So I'm sure that when you do, if they do CRISPR sequencing to find those particular defects, they can be found. But CRISPR and in vitro are two different sciences. It didn't change her DNA. It just gave her another way to have a baby. She still could fertilize an egg. Her womb just could not carry that baby.
So I can answer that a little bit as a Catholic too. So despite knowing many people that have done IVF as well and that kind of thing, I mean, the Catholic Church is against IVF for reasons of what you're kind of alluding to in some ways. So in IVF, you know, you're separating out the creation of life from the normal sexual union between a man and a woman, and you're doing it and you're leaving it at the hands of the doctors. When you do IVF, there's a lot of ethical questions that come up besides the fact of creation of embryos. Often there's many embryos that have to be created. Many are implanted. They can be selected. Some are frozen. So that doesn't sound normal to me. Not to say the many people I know that were conceived by IVF. So there's times when I think, does God want us to make these decisions? I know that sounds very simplistic, and as a scientist, maybe I sound ignorant of not using my mind, but sometimes I wonder, does God want us to have to figure out, you know, should I pick this embryo, that embryo? Should we make this change, like you were talking about, to, you know, help my child not have to suffer with this or that growing up? If someone's barren, adoption is an option, right? And so maybe there's a child out there for that family. I know people also who have gone through that same challenge and have adopted children, and they were living out God's plan. So I don't claim to have any answers necessarily, but it is a difficult issue. It's not black and white for sure. But coming from my perspective, and I, as a Catholic, and I agree with the Church's teaching on this, it makes sense to me in that regard. But that's just some thoughts from me. Yeah.
I can also speak a little bit to the final part of your question, which I believe was asking about the possibility that CRISPR could be a solution to mental health issues, intellectual disability. Did I understand your question right? Yeah. Yeah, so that's of course quite a bit outside of my lane. I don't know a lot about that field, but my understanding and impression is that there are a vast myriad of reasons why someone might struggle with mental health issues. Some of them are physiological, some of them are really driven by circumstances that the person is in. And the same is true with intellectual disability. Sometimes there's a clear physiological, genetically related cause, and in other cases it could be due to an injury or something that had nothing at all to do with a person's genetics. In my own case, and kind of building off of what Maria just mentioned, my wife and I were unable to have children of our own, and we did adopt a child now almost 10 years ago. It's hard to believe how time has flown by. But this is a child we adopted when he was 11, and he was born with a condition called schizencephaly, which is a severe brain malformation that occurred around the 20th or 21st week of pregnancy, and his left hemisphere never formed correctly. And what that led to was the same symptoms you might see in a stroke victim, where the right side of his body is especially weak and he has limited movement of his hand and his foot. He also has a significant seizure disorder, and some days can have dozens of seizures in one day. And not surprisingly, he also has a fairly significant intellectual disability as a result of this also, a very significant change in his brain. Several years ago, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, who's been giving him excellent care over the years, actually suggested sequencing his genome to see if there was a genetic explanation for the schizencephaly and the seizure disorder. And so, being a biochemist, of course, I was very curious to know if there was a genetic explanation at all. And so we happily enrolled him in the study. And so we didn't even have to pay the $299. It was done by the study. And interestingly enough, they did discover that he has a single nucleotide change in a gene called SRGAP3, which is, there's not a lot known about that gene, but it's been shown in studies in mice that that gene is critical for regulating neuronal migration during the formation of the lobes of the brain. And so he has a single nucleotide change that led to a premature stop codon in that gene. So it's possible, but by no means certain, that that single nucleotide change could explain his whole constellation of issues. But that being said, and this is of course just one data point, CRISPR technology would not be able to help him if this was discovered after his birth, which is when it was discovered. I guess he was almost 18 when we finally discovered this, right? Because his brain had already formed, and so that was it. There was nothing that can't unform it and get it to do it again. But that's not to say that there aren't other conditions where I could certainly imagine that CRISPR one day could develop to the place where neurons could be modified, and maybe if a seizure disorder that's triggering an intellectual disability is the result of an ion channel not functioning properly, then I could certainly imagine CRISPR being used to address that. That would be like a genetic disease. And potentially, if early enough in life, I think that's the key thing, early enough in life probably could chart a very different trajectory for a young person as the brain is developing.
Yeah. We have a question on Zoom for Drs. Green and Ficara from Lars Peterson. Lars writes, "This morning's panel unpacked humanity's place within the natural sciences and the innate desire to avoid death." That was brought up several times, right? That even the book *Sapiens*, right? He posits that the reason for religion is the fear of death, and whether or not any other species really understands their own death and their own mortality. As medicine and theology have and continue to evolve, do you think the value expectations placed on a healthy human life have changed through time? And if so, how has that impacted your view on genetic interventions? I ask, recognizing this question has beginning and end-of-life decision-making implications.
Can you repeat that last thing you just said? The last statement, can you please?
Just the last statement,
Yes.
I ask,
Okay.
recognizing this question has beginning and end-of-life implications.
Okay.
Value and expectations, sorry.
I don't think there's any less value placed on human life. If anything, science is moving to find ways to expand the lifespan of individuals and trying to find ways to have people live healthier lives so that they can live longer lives. So I don't see science or healthcare as placing any less value on human life. I'm not sure what they're looking for as far as implications for life and death. So I don't want to say anything regarding that because I'm a little unclear on that. But I do not see that there's any less value on human life.
I agree with the question and the panel in terms of fear of death. And I think certainly the way medicine is going, the goal is to live as long as you can. And we've had great interventions and medicines that, decades ago would have led to somebody dying at 50, and maybe they can live longer. But I guess the question is, and for anybody who's been through elderly grandparent or parent that's lived very long, but in poor health, like in the sense of just being kind of kept alive with different meds and things like that. Medicine has led to that this person probably would have died sooner, but because of various interventions survived and is getting older and older and older. So it's hard to say, because certainly you want to have access to things that could save lives and help people. But we have more dementia than ever, right? Because we have people living longer, and like 1 out of 3 people are probably going to get some kind of dementia or Alzheimer's, and that's a startling thought too, and something that probably wasn't a problem decades earlier because people weren't living as long. So I think it is a difficult question. Certainly, you want to look at quality of life. But I do feel that humans as a whole have an aversion to death, and the body is designed to kind of avoid death. Physiology, if you study physiology, things happen so that the body is trying to save itself. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's a very hard question. I don't know.
That dovetails into a question that I had, and I have the microphone, so I can ask it.
Yeah.
Because it strikes me as what you said is very true, that is kind of the point of all of this is to live as long as you possibly can. And we're barreling forward with all of this new medical technology that's allowing people to live longer and longer than ever before. I had never heard that 1 in 3 stat about dementia, and that's terrifying. I had heard that the more prevalence of cancer has to do with the fact that most people would have been killed by something a lot earlier than that.
Yeah.
But as we continue to cure these things, as we continue to make life longer and make healthcare more accessible to people, do we then as a society have a responsibility to take care of those people who would have otherwise died? That our population then explodes because we're allowing people to live longer, where on the other hand, we're not providing for them, for larger populations of people, especially larger populations of older generations who, maybe you can't throw them in the coal mines anymore. I mean, not that we're going to do that with anyone anymore, but you know what I mean.
Society should assist in some way in providing, and I think you can see now, I don't know if you're watching TV, it's so many commercials that are coming up now about home health agencies, and they are just cropping up everywhere. Trying to provide resources so that you can keep your loved one at home longer, and as they're growing older, then you need assistance. And there should be a way that we can keep our loved ones home and get assistance from social agencies, government funded or church funded or denominational funded, however, we should be able to get assistance from social agencies to help us, to help individuals take care of their loved ones as they age and to keep them home, as opposed to having to put them into a facility.
I think taking a slightly different perspective on the overall question, which is kind of getting at how should we deal with the reality of death. And of course, I certainly hope I have many years left, but I also recognize that at the age of almost 54, I'm definitely in the second half of my life at this point. I would not say that I want to live as long as possible, but I definitely want to have a good quality of life as long as possible. And I know that means I should exercise more and things like that. But this is where I think a Christian faith perspective is so precious, because our faith in Jesus Christ is what gives us the ability to say, I'm not afraid to die. I'm afraid of maybe some of the ways that it could happen, but I'm not afraid to leave this world, because I know that leaving this world only means that this stage of my life is ending and a new stage is beginning that will go on forever. That's the promise that I have from Scripture, and that is what should take away our fear of death. And so I don't hope that I'm around as long as possible. I hope I have a quality of life that takes me decades to come. But when it's time to go, I'm ready.
Thank you. Amen. Yeah. How many of you were here last year for the symposium? Last year, one of the points that Dr. Devin Stahl made was that of the groups polled, Christians were most likely to pursue aggressive treatment at the end of life.
Wow.
The most likely to do whatever it takes to stay alive. And so I think for all of you pastors out there and people who are shepherding flocks of folks who are dealing with the end of life, there is a long road between our ideals and our beliefs and how we actually move through the world. So let's hold on to that hope in the end of life, that we need not fear death.
I love what you said about, is this a problem or an inconvenience? However, is it true that seems to be a big root of the problem, that we haven't defined what a disease is versus an inconvenience? And so as long as we're debating on what that is, we can't decide if we can cure a disease, because simply it's an inconvenience. Mm-hmm. Is Down syndrome a disease, or is it an inconvenience? Is being deaf a disease or an inconvenience? And sort of a follow-up to that, too, is that does this ability to possibly preemptively cure these things take away our desire to find out the cause of why they've spiked? So why is it that dementia is spiking? Well, if we can just take it away in an embryo, maybe we'll never figure out the reason that we've been causing a rise in certain diseases. So those are the... Good luck. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think you've really hit it on the head, that there never will be a uniformly agreed upon definition of what genetic issues would be considered medically related diseases versus ones that are inconvenience. Probably, I'm sort of imagining 40 or 50 years hence, when insurance covers these kinds of things, and maybe the insurance company will agree to pay for CRISPR for this set of conditions, but you're on your own for these other sets of conditions, just like it is now. You can get Botox injections if you have strabismus, an eye disorder, movement disorder, and that's covered, but then you can't get Botox injections covered if you're dealing with wrinkles, right? So it might be that ultimately insurance companies will decide what they're going to pay for, and then that. But you're quite right that right now some people would look at being maybe in the lower 10 or 20% of the adult height kind of category as being inconvenient but not a problem. In other words, being fully grown and being 5'4" or something like that. Whereas other people would consider that a very significant problem. And in fact, just last week I was reading about the growing popularity of a very painful surgery that in fact some men are now getting, more so than women, I think, to have their femurs broken and titanium rods inserted in order to add between 3 and 6 inches to their height. There's actually a fairly well-known orthopedic surgeon in Nevada who performs this surgery, among other places. And they're reporting that they seem to get more respect in the workplace and things like that when they're 5 or 6 inches taller than they used to be. And so, some would say, well, being whatever height you are as an adult, it's okay. It's fine. Maybe you can't reach everything, but it's okay. Others would say, no, this is a serious problem that demands tens of thousands of dollars of medical care and months of recovery and things like that. And so ultimately, people fall on different sides of this. Yeah, there never will be an accepted definition, I think, but probably there will be a number of conditions that everyone, almost everyone, could agree are definitely worthy of using CRISPR and other kinds of genetic approaches to treat. I mentioned before a whole class of diseases called inborn errors of metabolism, in which there's typically a single mutation in a gene that's involved in metabolism that often can have some of the most devastating and debilitating kinds of quality of life implications in a person's life. And those are the sorts that actually could be more easily treated with an approach like CRISPR. But then, on the other hand, there are lots of other things in life that have to do more with ability and shape and size and color and things like that that I would personally say are more inconveniences, personal preferences, but not something that would qualify as needing medical intervention. Yeah. And I think it would be a shame if, in the end, so much of this technology ends up getting used to change people's eye color, hair color, more superficial kinds of things, when in reality there are devastating diseases that really need this kind of an approach. And if resources are all sent over to these other things and not a lot of effort and investment is made in trying to address real medical conditions that could be helped, I think we've really missed it, just like we have in a number of other areas.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I want to go back a little bit to some things I heard in your opening statement. And I'm not really sure if it's a question, but it has me just thinking as I continue to listen. I was a former nurse for 20 years, and now I'm a pastor, so I fully understand the ethical issues that are incorporated into science and faith and making all of these decisions and conversations. In your opening statements, you talked a lot about the difference between using CRISPR and modifying genetics in an embryo, and your personal opinions about either. But I wonder if theologically we believe, and not we meaning me, not speaking for everybody, but if theologically we believe that creation has free will, in addition to humanity having free will, when I hear changing the embryo opposed to the way God created it, that just has me thinking of a particular view of God. Because if creation has free will, do we believe that God created a natural order and natural processes, and creation has a free will in order to play that out, which is why there are hurricanes, etc. Versus God specifically created this embryo to be, in your words, less than perfect, for whatever that means. So I'm just wondering theologically how that plays into your thinking on that, or maybe it doesn't. And then just a follow-up to, along those lines, a lot of the phrasing of created in the image of God. This is us changing the creation in the image of God. This morning we had a lot of conversation about our tendency as humans to anthropomorphize God. And so I'm wondering, using that phrasing, talking specifically about an embryo that may not be perfect, is that anthropomorphizing the image of God, or what exactly is the image of God? Easy answers, I know, but just my thinking, maybe I'm just thinking out loud.
No, so in terms of your first question, are you saying that because we have free will, we could have free will to change the embryo? Is that?
No, I'm saying that.
Thank you.
No, that if creation has free will in order to be creation, to live out the natural processes, ecosystems that creation does, right? There's moon, stars, precipitation, all those things. Is not the making of an embryo a part of creation's free will, that the sperm and the egg come together in whatever way they come together, versus God saying that embryo with this imperfection, I'm making it. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think when a child is conceived, when a child is conceived, free will had taken part in that, but that it is God's creative power that allows that child to be conceived, right? So we are agents of we have free will, and we are, I mean, a couple would be considered like co-creators with God in the sense that they were involved in the process, obviously, and use their free will to open themselves up to creation with God. But in a test tube, God allows that to happen too. I mean, God is behind everything in terms of, I don't know. Help me out. This is harder than it looks.
Can I clarify? Maybe. So is there a distinction between God creating an embryo and God creating a hurricane? Where one we say, natural processes made this, and God's not responsible for destroying Florida again. And the other one we say, God definitely made this thing, and we don't think as much about just the natural processes and the natural genetic deformalities that happen all the time through random chance, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, well, of course, the insurance company still says that the hurricane was an act of God.
Always about the insurance view. The insurance company shall inherit the earth. I'm hearing.
It is a very interesting question, because when we look just at the process of conception itself, it's clearly what seems from the outside to be a lot of randomness involved. It was the bazillions of sperm that descend upon the egg. One of them gets to fertilize and locks out all the others, right? And then that seems to be a fairly random process. And I don't know that it's necessarily even the one that got there first. I think it's the one that managed to engage a certain receptor first and then was able to then lock the others out. And then, of course, the essentially random process of meiosis that gives rise to the combinations of chromosomes that were in the egg and the sperm that happened to meet, and then for the ovulation that took place to release one egg out of the many that are in the ovary. All of that seems to be fairly random from the outside. And yet, I don't know if we can necessarily conclude for sure that it was all completely random. Things that look random don't necessarily mean that they are random. It just means that we don't understand how they happened, and we couldn't possibly have predicted it. Right? I'm thinking too about the story in Scripture, this fascinating story in John, in which Jesus and his disciples encountered a man who had been born blind, and the disciples were coming at this problem from their own theological perspective, which was that this man's blindness must have been the result of somebody's sin. And they wanted to know, was it his own sin or was it his parents' sin that led to this, right? And that fit within their theological understanding of the cause of disease in their society. And Jesus' answer, of course, was that neither this man nor his parents sinned to bring this about. Now, Jesus didn't explain why he ended up blind, but Jesus did go on to say that this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. Like I've had to think long and hard at times about why my son was born with schizencephaly. We don't know why this happened. If it were to be because of the genetic change that was found, it seems like his brain developed just according to the instructions that he was given at conception. If this happened due to a stroke or due to an injury or something like that, then again, there just seems to be no way that we can really wrap our minds about why this happened. And yet, time and time and time and time again, I've seen the power of God displayed in my son's life. And so, if anything, the words that Jesus gave to his disciples who were wondering why this guy ended up blind echo a lot in my own mind as I think about the challenges that my son faces. And I realized too that Jesus didn't leave that person blind. Jesus healed him. And so Jesus' goal in the whole thing was to display God's power and bring him to a state of healing again. Yeah. It wasn't as if Jesus said, well, that's how he was conceived and maybe it was a genetic cause and so we're just going to leave it like that. Jesus intervened and did something to display God's power. And the display of God's power in somebody's life is not always the healing that we pray for. It might be displayed in some other way. But it could be displayed in a healing. Could be. I don't know if that gets the question or not. But.
Dr. Green, I have a question for you from Zoom, somewhat paraphrased from Elton Richardson. Do you think there's a time when we should just stop developing new treatments, new medications, where we've cured enough and we're done?
No.
Is there an end?
God gives ability to scientists to try to find a way to cure a disease. Diseases are not stopping. Diseases are those that have been eradicated or cropping back up. So no, as long as there is the ability to research and to find a way to help individuals with diseases, then scientists should do what they have been gifted to do, to try to find ways to improve the well-being of individuals.
Thank you.
I would add too that in addition to developing new technologies, I think there also needs to be continuous efforts to make those discoveries available to more and more people who need them. Because oftentimes the really exciting developments are available to a very select few group of people that maybe have outstanding insurance or even before insurance companies pay for it, enough money to fund it themselves. But ultimately there's many more people beyond that limited group that can be early adopters of a new benefit that also need the help that therapy can provide.
Eliminating disparities.
Suffering seems to have two roles. One is probably to be avoided, but I think there's also a sense in where suffering is to get us to grow or to help us to reflect God's image in how we respond to it or whatever. How do we balance the two sides of suffering? You know, one to be avoided and one to be almost embraced, because we're told if we suffer with Christ, we will share in his resurrection.
I think that's related to your level of faith. Suffering, and for some reason this question brings me back to systematic theology, yes. And Dr. Brash. But suffering is a part of life, and how you endure that it depends on your level of faith and your connection with God and the people that God places around you to help you through your suffering. Whether you're suffering as in the parable that he just mentioned, whether you're suffering so that the goodness and the power of God is revealed through your condition, or whether you're suffering because there is something that God needs you to learn, how you come through that suffering is contingent upon your level of faith. And your faith in God, your faith in what the outcome is, your faith in what God is trying to show you through this particular predicament, and whether you want to endure that so that God shows you or God gets glorified through your deliverance.
And I think too, like in terms of your own suffering, it may feel pointless to you, even with faith. There are times, I'm sure, where you can throw your hands up in the air and wonder why is this happening or whatever. But we don't know the whole picture at all about what our embracing of our own suffering is doing for others, and and how God is working through that. So I think as human beings, if we don't see something in our face, it's hard to think that there's anything there. But there's a lot we're not seeing with all of these kind of questions. And I think we almost have to humble ourselves enough to realize that, we don't have the complete picture of all of these kinds of questions and things, and that God does. And we'll find out someday, but we don't have that knowledge now, maybe. Yeah.
And certainly when I think about my own life, some of the most painful periods of suffering that I've experienced maybe more recently in my life have actually come about because God had led me to step into the circumstances and suffering of another person who was close to me. And I perhaps could have avoided some of it by just not being willing to do that. And yet God was calling me to come alongside of this other person. And that meant, in some cases, experiencing parts of that person's suffering also. And it was painful and difficult, but also extraordinarily rewarding too, to experience God's grace in the midst of that.
Hello. I've worked in healthcare for about 32 years, and my introduction to genetics, though, was with a daughter who was born with trisomy 18, who lived to 29 years, and 10% of the children survive the first year. So for us to have 29 years was amazing. And I used to go through life saying, when people ask me, why do you think this happened? I said, well, it's just a genetic malformation. The genes were messed up. But I think as I lived through this process and had someone talk to me about, the man born blind and what God did and revealed, and that the question was wrong, I think my answer was wrong in that I realized that I am very influenced by what we in the world all put on television and look of what is God's ultimate person is the person who's cute and, and spunky and this and that and can do all these things. And I thought, and I asked God, I said, is that what your view is? And my answer was, absolutely not. She is actually made exactly like I want her to be. And you're missing out because you're trying to figure something out that I did that I didn't do. So I think so much of this is our perspective of what the world has influenced us, of what healthy or productive people should be. And I talk about that, and I've had conversations and spoken in medical conferences and stuff about what we expect and what we don't know. And I said, my child is never going to grow up to go into a school and shoot people, but the child that's born to that parent of the child who ends up going and shooting looks perfectly fine and is really well. So you cannot predict the value of a child based on their production or anybody in life. So I just feel like the genetics doesn't predict how valuable and how we should embrace someone for that. And then my other concern that one of you brought up is we're talking about this in a first world country with first world values, and we're missing the whole rest of the world that God cares about, who don't even have running water and don't have other things. And I guess I have concerns about there's so much else we could do to make everybody healthier without doing this. And I work in a hospital, and I know we live in a capitalistic society, and I constantly tell families this who come in with older adults, well, isn't there some place there's going to go and somebody's going to take care of them? And I said, we live in this country, and we believe if you have money and you can pay for it, you can get it. Otherwise, you don't get it here unless you have a strong faith community or somebody who loves you to take care of it. So I think that, for me, is a very ethical decision, too, is like, we're creating a system where we want to make people live longer and do all this. And I understand, there's all these advertisements for healthcare, but there's not enough workers. And if you've had any experience through COVID, you know that, every nursing home lost staff. Everybody lost staff, and we don't have the ability to care for one another. And I just think God must be looking at us going, what's going on with you and your thinking in your churches? Because we're not doing and caring for who's in front of us, and yet we're so concerned about creating that special child or special person and fixing everything. We have so much we could fix that we all could fix without being scientists.
You got 3 amens in the chat, by the way. We have time for one more. Make it a complicated one.
So you have time for a complicated question. Behind this discussion is, of course, the enormous realm of ethics and the thinking that goes into making ethical decisions. When we have the ability to help someone, do we have an obligation to help someone? Now, I specifically related to CRISPR. If I have the ability to make this embryo's future life better because of a new technology, and here I'm going to narrow my focus to by curing a disease ahead of time, rather than something eugenic. By curing a disease, is it ethical based on a specific view of God or a specific religious ethic to impose a restriction on that cure? Especially in a society where there is a diversity of religions.
I think, it's an excellent question. And I think ultimately, if we're talking about an embryo, then we're clearly talking about parents of that embryo being involved in the decision-making process, right? And parents certainly should always have the freedom to make the decision that they think is best for their child. And if the technology is available, and this is a significant compelling medical need, then I would think that parents ought to be free to make the decision to proceed with a treatment like that if there's a reasonably high likelihood that it would help. I guess I'm approaching it more from a medical perspective here, as you sort of narrowed the question to that. And the decision-making, from my point of view, would be similar to the same decision-making that any parent would need to make when considering a major surgery, for example, for a child, heart surgery, brain surgery, something like that. I mean, there are obviously risks. There obviously are some significant benefits that could come from it. Otherwise, the doctors hopefully aren't recommending it. But I would see it maybe in that same framework, that the same decision-making that would go into deciding to proceed with heart surgery for a 1-year-old or something like that would also be factored in, because I personally, like my colleague Maria, would see an embryo as a human being. It's a human being. This is a person, even though it's a very tiny one, but a person. And so I would think that the same decision-making, the same parental rights ought to apply there too. The parents would be the ones that ought to make that decision. I would hate to think that maybe a hospital or a government would come in and say that this must be done, because ultimately I think the parents are the ones who would need to make that decision. And that if the technology is there and the chance of success is reasonably high, the same criteria we would use for other medical interventions in children, then they ought to have the freedom to go forward with it. That's my view.
I concur with what Jeff said. I mean, I think just because we have the ability doesn't mean we have the obligation. I think it's up to the people involved to weigh the risks. Like for any treatment, for example, if someone had a chemotherapy that was open to them, but that's the ability to treat them, but they maybe don't want to, or there's other things beyond that they want to do. So I don't think I think it's up to the people to decide.
A follow-up. I noticed that there was a turn to the negative. They should have the right to do it, and they shouldn't be inhibited from doing it. Should the government say not to do it? So in effect, a specific religious ethic, let's say that government decision to have a law, let's say, that this particular intervention should not be done because of the specific religious preference of the government, hypothetically. Does that, in effect, make the child and those parents, are they being compelled not to do it? Has that religious ethic made them a casualty of the religious ethic?
I think we have plenty of places in the world where government edicts are in tremendous conflict with religious ethics. Some totalitarian societies don't allow people of certain faiths to even gather together in corporate worship. And there also are places in the world where certain kinds of medical treatments that we know could actually help children are not permitted in those countries. So there are such examples. It puts the parents in a very difficult position. Yeah.
I like something that has been said several times today. I don't have the answer to this. I've heard it from every panel and every speaker so far. And I think that is so important. Today is a day of reveling in more complicated questions than what you came with. And maybe disassembling some of the easy answers that you had assumed. And I'm really grateful for your willingness to do that, the three of you bringing your varied expertise. I will say, just to round it out when thinking about religious exceptions and whatnot, that of the Ashkenazi Jewish population, which were the people descendant primarily from Eastern Europe, because of all of the restrictions that the Christian government put on them and their travel, there was a lot of intermarriage within the small tribes, and so there's a lot of genetic disorders, and 1 in 4 Ashkenazi Jewish people are carriers of serious diseases like Tay-Sachs that don't lead to really any quality of life, and they see this sort of treatment as a miracle. There's rabbinic regulations put on. Actually, interestingly, that when Ashkenazi couple gets married, a lot of times they'll both do genetic tests to see if they're carriers, and if they are, and they still insist on having children, they will do it in IVF, and then will test the embryos to see which ones are carriers. But then there are rabbinic restrictions put in place on how you're able to choose from them. That you're only allowed, it needs to be random once you have found the healthy ones. So in that very different religious world, they're asking different questions, but very similar questions. Or at least they're asking the same questions from a different perspective. And so I'm really grateful to hear from your perspectives, from Protestant and Catholic perspectives on life, on what it means to be human, and what it means maybe biologically to be made in the image of God. I also might add another biblical reference for those of you struggling, as the woman at the microphone was earlier, between the kind of, is God responsible for embryos the same way God's responsible for hurricanes? Did God create this person to be this way? That perhaps alongside of Joseph, that what biology has meant for chaos, God has meant for good. And that it is God makes meaning out of anything. Another perspective to throw out there. Again, there's no answers today. There's only more interesting questions. And speaking of more interesting questions, would you like to hear from someone who is actually using CRISPR to treat diseases? Because I know I sure would. I would love to not just be talking theoretically, but to hear from a scientist, a doctor themselves. And so let's take a 15-minute break. And when we come back, Dr. Kieran Musunuru will share about his research and about the treatments and the really exciting things that he is currently doing right now, not hypothetically, but right now. So thank you, panel, so much.